Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnac and my co-host Robert Branton are joined today by Marissa Nobauer, Director of Reconciliation, Community Engagement, and External Relations at TELUS. We're also joined today by Carol Anne Hilton, CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute, to discuss a critical issue for investors in Canada: how corporate reconciliation with Indigenous communities is shaping governance, risk, and long-term value. TELUS, a leading Canadian telecommunications and technology company, has created the Indigenous Advisory Council, IAC, to ensure that reconciliation is embedded in its business strategy. Through ongoing engagement with Indigenous leaders and subject matter experts, the IAC provides a structured framework for aligning corporate practices with the legal rights, expectations, and economic aspirations of Indigenous communities across Canada. This discussion provides key insights for investors seeking to understand how Indigenous partnerships and reconciliation commitments can mitigate uncertainty, facilitate regulatory compliance, and enhance ESG performance in the Canadian investment landscape. Welcome to Drumbeats, Marissa Nobauer from TELUS and Carol Anne Hilton from Indigenomics.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good morning, Marissa. Carol Anne, great to have you with us.
Thank you. Looking forward to the conversation.
So really exciting time with, the changes. We have a new government in Canada, cabinet's been announced, and everybody in Canada and beyond is looking, okay, how are we going to develop successfully, continue to be a strong, attractive economic destination where the Indigenous peoples have a seat at the table, which is, I think, one of the really exciting times that we're at this stage in our development. And Indigenous peoples are at the table as title holders, investors, and equity partners. But before we get into some of those bigger discussions, why don't each of you give a little bit of background on yourself? And perhaps, Marissa, as you're from TELUS, and Carol Anne also is part of that organization as an advisor, why don't you tell us a little bit about TELUS as an organization, and then what's set up there, and then we can switch over to Carol Anne.
Sure, that would be lovely. Wonderful to be here today. So my name's Marissa Nobauer. So I am the Director of Reconciliation, Community Engagement, and External Relations here at TELUS. Privilege of calling into you today from the unceded territory of the Coquitlam people, where I get to live with my son and my husband. It's also known as Coquitlam. And as I speak to you today, I'm so thrilled because I'm looking out the window and I see green, and it's just such a beautiful time of year to be here and in this territory. I'm settler heritage on both sides of my family. My dad's family were German Dutch migrants who migrated from Europe to Canada after the Second World War. And my mom's family were what we thought were Ukrainian Jews, but now maybe we're learning we're Lithuanian Jews, still learning, that left Europe in the late 1800s. And I had the privilege of actually growing up in the Lower Mainland here. So I'm a West Coast girl through and through. Webbed toes. In my role at TELUS, have the immense responsibility and opportunity to support TELUS's reconciliation strategy. TELUS is a Canadian telecom and technology company here in Canada. We provide not only wireline or mobility services to citizens and people in Canada across the country. We've actually invested more than any other telecom operator in Canada over the last several years. But in addition to that, TELUS at its core is a company that believes in leveraging connectivity for good, right? When you think about what connectivity is, once you have connectivity, the remarkable outcomes that it drives are numerous. You can access virtual healthcare, right? Think about the fact that you don't actually have to drive 6 hours from your community to the doctor. You can actually stay at home in your community to see the doctor. You can leverage technology for education. You can leverage technology for agriculture. Think about the massive food instability we have across the world today. How can you leverage technology to drive better food security outcomes? So as an organization, when you actually look at what we've done over time, we started as a telecommunications company in in Canada. And over the years, we've really focused on how do we broaden that scope to support customers beyond just broadband, but also leverage that technology. We have now invested in healthcare, and we are currently enhancing the lives of 76 million people worldwide through an innovative preventive medicine. And our TELUS agriculture and consumer goods business actually utilizes digital technologies and data insights to optimize that connection between producers and consumers. And lastly, we're a give where we live company. Everything we do comes back to how are we supporting the people that are living in the communities where we live and serve. And that all comes back to the work that we get to do through our reconciliation commitments, which is the opportunity and responsibility we have as a corporation to be working partnership hand in hand with Indigenous peoples and communities to advance the opportunities that exist in this country for everybody. So a little bit about me, and Carol Anne's a Indigenous Advisory Council member and a key part of helping TELUS maintain our commitments.
Super, Marissa. Thank you for that background. Great to hear about yourself and about TELUS, which is a great purpose-driven firm. I was really interested, and I'm sure our listeners here in the UK, when you mentioned about driving 6 hours for a medical appointment, because if you drive 6 hours in this country, you can go from London up to Scotland. So it reinforces the vastness of Canada, which I think a lot of people don't appreciate so much. And when you talk about those challenges, because the population is spread out across the country, especially the Indigenous peoples, there are a lot of challenges and opportunities that go with that. But that's a great intro, Marissa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, pleasure to have you with us, Marissa. I've got colleagues at McCarthy Tétreault who've worked with TELUS and have been quite involved with TELUS over the years, and they have nothing but good things to say about the culture at TELUS. And Carol Anne, you're part of that culture too. You're an advisor and part of the Indigenous Advisory Committee. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and that committee?
Wonderful. Thank you. My name is Carol Anne Hilton, and I am the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute, the Global Center of Indigenomics, and the Global Indigenous Technology House. We keep very busy here in our inspiration. I am Nuu-chah-nulth from the west coast of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. It's on the far, far west coast, ocean people. I actually did my international MBA through the University of Hertfordshire in the UK. The development of the concept of Indigenomics as a platform for modern Indigenous economic design. The understanding of Indigenomics as a design platform. We are a financial, economic, and technology innovation platform. And being able to shape a narrative around this metaphor of Indigenous peoples taking our seat at the economic table, of the rise of Indigenous economic power, and the required understanding of the participation of Indigenous peoples in the value chain and how that is occurring and how that is leveraging and creating a foundation of Indigenous economic power today. That concept of the rise of Indigenous economic power is central to understanding the increasing visibility of Indigenous economic participation, both nationally and internationally. Thank you.
Great to have you with us, Carol Anne. I've heard a lot about, and of course, across Canada, everyone knows about your firm, which is doing great leadership work to help raise this profile. And I guess that's one of the points that come back to it in terms of the stage that we're at in Canada, or Canadians are at, with the participation of the Indigenous peoples. And coming back to, TELUS as the organization we're speaking about, you're also on the advisory board. And how does the advisory board play a role in TELUS? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think that TELUS was an early mover in leadership of demonstrating accountable, transparent action in building reconciliation outcomes. And in demonstrating that early leadership has created and opened the floodgates of positive peer pressure among corporations to engage in building tangible, visible outcomes and accountable pathways to those results over time. So big respect for the work of TELUS, and always an honor to participate in the pioneer work of building economic outcomes in Indigenous economy. Thank you.
Great. And Marissa, you've been with TELUS for about 7 years, I think you said. And how has TELUS's relationship with Indigenous people changed over that time?
Yeah, I think when I look at what's happening across the landscape of Canada and Indigenous economics and Indigenous participation, the difference between 10 years ago and now, the difference between 5 years ago and now, is just it's evolving at such a rapid, light speed pace because of the work of pioneers like Carol Anne Hilton and others who are really pushing and the needle to say we need to do more, we need to move faster. Because when we all work together economically, it benefits every single one of us that are living here today. You know, when I started at TELUS 7 years ago, the focus that we were on was about how do we work together to connect Indigenous communities to advance broadband internet. Rob or Mark, one of you made the comment about the vastness of Canada, right? When you think about it, I can't remember the exact stat, but somewhat between 95 and 98% of the population of Canada lives within 100 kilometers of the American border, right? The vastness of this country is significant. And when we look at connecting communities, when you look at connecting small and remote communities with only 100, maybe 100 homes or 30 homes that are, let's say, 6-hour drive from the nearest medium-sized city, it's a very expensive proposition to be able to connect those communities to the same advanced broadband network that you would have in London or any other major city. And so TELUS recognized really early on that we needed to ensure that we are playing our role as a telecommunications provider in supporting Indigenous connectivity. So when I started in my role, I really started on how are we working? How do we do it in a respectful manner to work with Indigenous communities to get them connected to pure fiber, to this lightning fast gigabit speed internet? And how do we do it in a reciprocal manner? How do we do it based on relationships and based what meets the needs of communities? Because not all communities will want the same things. And so we need to really meet each community at that level and partner with them one by one by one. And so that's a big part of what I did. And as we went through it, we went, there's a big economic problem here. TELUS, as a privately held shareholder company, has certain business outcomes that we need to meet. And we need to develop rich partnerships in order to support Indigenous connectivity. So we've partnered with Indigenous communities, the federal government here, as well as provincial governments to work together in public-private partnerships to be able to connect communities to advanced broadband internet. So we can bring in our expertise with funding support, the expertise of Indigenous communities to be able to connect them to advanced broadband network. And one of the great privileges of my life has been this work that we've done in this space. And over the past 7 years that I've been with this company, we have invested over $22 million to connect over 200 Indigenous lands to our advanced broadband connectivity network. And the real-time impact that's having is just phenomenal. The minute you have connectivity, you can stay in your community and you can encourage people to come home from the community. And people are actually traveling home to community to live in community because they can work their jobs there as well as they can in an urban center.
It does sound amazing, and it sounds maybe simpler than it probably is to get that connectivity. You've got to build things like towers. I assume you've got to dig through territories to lay fiber. All of that requires cooperation and buy-in and engagement. The local community, that must be some exercise.
It is. It's a lot of work, but I think it's also part of how you live and work in any jurisdiction. In any jurisdiction, when you're building projects, you need to engage with those who it's going to impact, right? And I think one of the things that we don't think about or we don't talk about enough is how the importance of Indigenous knowledge in making these projects better, right? When you engage with the rights holders and when you engage with those who are on the ground, they can tell you exactly where the rocks are better. And this is me as a non-engineer, where the rocks are better to site that tower, because things over here always sink, but things here never sink or in a stable spot. People can tell me, and we've been able to move entire lines because a community was able to provide their knowledge that said, hey, look, this is going to be rehabilitated from a salmon perspective because in the past they weren't there. And so we've moved entire lines that actually have allowed us to have a better and cheaper connectivity line than what was before. And then just my last example is, sometimes you're right, it can be difficult getting things and we have to be really creative. And we worked and hired a local fisherman who knew the Fraser Canyon, which is like a really remote area here in BC, so well that he can predict where the water is going to go. And he was able to take our technicians and help bring a fiber line over a 300-foot canyon to be able to connect these two remote communities on the other side of the canyon to high-speed internet. So I think, yes, it's a lot of work, but the outcomes that we get out of it and the learnings that our team gets out of it because of local Indigenous knowledge makes everything that much better.
Wow, that is impressive. And that's the difference, because there's on-the-ground knowledge that the Indigenous people still have that in most of the rest of the world, or some of the more developed countries like the UK, which is a nation of immigrants from 1066 onwards, they've lost that local knowledge that was here 1,000, 2,000 years ago. But Carol Anne, it's all those sort of small projects, and 22 million is a big number, but you talk a lot about how we go and get to the $100 billion Indigenous economy. So do you want to kind of pull all that together and put that in perspective of what you're identifying needs to be done in that regard?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So in 2019, the Canadian government, with limited data, had identified the size of the Indigenous economy was around 32 billion. In understanding the limitations of the data, in understanding the limitations of the uptake of the perspective of an increase of Indigenous economic activity, the shortcomings of measurement and the shortcomings of insight into the rise of the Indigenous economy was paramount. At that time, I had identified through this concept of Indigenomics that a $100 billion Indigenous economy was essential to Canada's economic future, and that Indigenous participation was centered to that. In looking at the tripling of Indigenous economic value since that time frame, it has become readily apparent with the ever consistent demonstration of Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned projects over $1 billion level of value, project value. The demonstration of the reality of $100 billion of Indigenous economic activity is not only achievable, what we're looking at is essentially what it means to be ready for Indigenous economic power. There's a difference in perspective of the experience of the Indigenous people, Indigenous business, and the Indigenous economy at 32 billion versus really what does it mean to get ready beyond $100 billion Indigenous economy. And that's what we're looking at here in Canada. To understand this perspective of Indigenous people taking our seat at the economic table, taking our rightful place, essentially means that push and pull between the economic and the legal happens in a way that as Indigenous people advance rights and advance legal jurisdiction, it establishes the requirement for everyone to move over at the economic table. And that's what we're seeing here in Canada is a fundamental shifting of the increase of jurisdiction, authority, recognition, and increase of Indigenous economic activity.
Carol Anne, maybe talk a little bit about how the advisory committee works and what role you play, what sort of issues you advise. Tell us on.
I think that the advancement of corporate reconciliation action planning is creating a field that demonstrates essentially what leadership looks like, what ethics looks like, what outcomes looks like, what data supports that, and how the value uptake across a company becomes essential to understand that a top-down perspective and an actual cultural foundation of valuing the Indigenous economic relationship. I think to define what is economic reconciliation is best understood in action. And to be able to reflect on the ability to speak to a story of positive commitments, positive values, positive ethics, and tangible outcomes. I think that TELUS has been leading in a clear demonstration of building a solid plan, building accountability to that plan, and building visibility that demonstrates commitment across the value chain of the company. And I think it's in that space that the demonstration of economic reconciliation and tangible economic metrics are becoming increasingly visible in this narrative of the rise of Indigenous economic power.
With that Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan, you've had that opportunity to work with TELUS over a number of years now to really embed that in the company. What were some of the challenges? So, you could be a UK corporate here. Okay, they've got subsidiaries in Canada. They may or may not have gone through that process. So how would you direct a UK corporate with their subsidiaries in Canada, who perhaps they haven't talked about this at the top table back to the head office, right? Obviously they should be, because it's fundamental success in Canada now. Could you outline that a little bit, Carol Anne?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes down to the fundamentals of understanding and creating the commitment to understand the significance of the Indigenous relationship in Canada, to have the foundation elements of that evolving spectrum of understanding and the base foundation of concepts such as the evolution of Indigenous rights, the recognition within the Constitution, international Indigenous rights frameworks, to look at that as a toolkit to understand the foundational elements of understanding. I think to look to the UK to build that understanding is to fill that toolkit with key documents, key frameworks, and key understandings of the significance of the Indigenous relationship in Canada itself.
Yes, and the Indigenous peoples have a special relationship with the Crown, and sometimes in the UK, it's not really appreciated or understood. That relationship, but also Canada being a parliamentary democracy with a constitution, which was one of the huge changes when the Constitution was repatriated back in Canada. The rights of the Indigenous people were recognized, because up till now, the UK does not have a written constitution. There's been discussion in the recent past, maybe that is something that should be happening. So I think Canada has a unique model with parliamentary democracy, that written constitution, and we've seen over the past number of years, in terms of the Supreme Court ruling on the rights of the Indigenous people, and they have to be recognized. And when you were introduced, you talked about unceded territories and Treaty Number 6, perhaps, as an example. So it's a complex business issue that has to be dealt with. This is not ESG and some other issues that, you can maybe go in this direction. In Canada, you have no choice, which is for the good of the country, in my opinion, because I think it'll put us at a leading edge, and where Canada, we can reach the full potential that this land has always offered, now that we have a true partnership between the Indigenous people and the settlers. And I think when Mark Carney was traveling before the election, just after his installed first time, and came over and said, Canada is the most European of non-European countries. I thought that's not who we are. That's looking at things through the old perspective of Canada is about the French and the English. Of course not. First of all, it's the Indigenous people. And then the settlers, as Marissa mentioned earlier, came after. So, Rob, do you want to talk about some of those bigger constitutional issues?
Yeah, well, you mentioned partnerships, and I was curious, Marissa, it sounds like TELUS is not just providing a service or building things in nations' territories, but it sounds like you're in partnership in some cases, supporting local businesses, whether that's through procurement or maybe other means. Are you seeing nations take an equity stake in parts of the business that maybe affect their territories?
Yeah, I think I wanted to add on one comment about companies in Europe or in England, excuse me, coming over here and what they need to know. It just doubled down on what Carol Anne said. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, anytime you go into any country, you need to learn and you need to understand who it is that you're engaging with. You know, if you're going to travel to Japan, I bet you're going to sit down and really understand the customs of working in Japan. And I think traditionally, and you speak to this, you know, people come to Canada and they're like, oh, Canada, you know, Canada, they speak English. It's just in French, excuse me. It's just, you know, like working here, but it's not. And I think that comes back to just the fundamental lack of understanding that we have globally on the fundamental basis of who Canada is and where it's evolved over time. And so I think starting with what the shared history of this country is, and I call it the shared history because it is a collective shared history when you're living here today, what that shared history of this country is. And that's really part of what we did at TELUS to be able to advance our reconciliation commitments is we need to start with the what. What is our shared history? Why do we have Section 35 of the Constitution, right? Why do we have all of this case law? We need to start with that and understand, to your point, is it's not ESG, it's not D&I. It's a completely separate thing that stems from the fact that Indigenous peoples were on the land first. And we need to understand that. We need to recognize it. And Indigenous peoples, they have built the way for how to do it, right? All you have to look at is all of these documents that Indigenous people have built for those non-Indigenous peoples to understand how to do that work. UNDRIP is a great one. And in Canada, we've actually implemented both federally and here in BC where I live. The 231 calls for justice, which was established as a result of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls epidemic here. 231 calls on ways that individuals, corporations, governments, you name it, can play a role. And then I'm getting to your point, Rob, around procurement, 94 calls to action. So the 94 calls to action came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada. You know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission went around the country to talk to survivors and to talk to Indigenous people. And out of that, you have 94 calls to action on what we can do as organizations, as humans, as citizens, as non-citizens, and play our role. And call to action number 92 was a specific call to corporate Canada or corporations operating in Canada. And underneath that, there's 3 ways that it says you can start in advancing reconciliation. Number 1 is ensure that you understand what the shared history of this country is. Number 2 is ensuring that Indigenous people are participating in projects that affect their lands. And number 3 is how are you supporting Indigenous participation in your organizations, whether that's through procurement or whether that's through employment or other various ways. I think every corporation in Canada has a different way in which they're going to be supporting economic growth in Indigenous communities, right? You have resource extraction, which has a very specific impact on the land. You have telecommunications, which, and I have to correct my comment from earlier, we're spending $22 million this year. We've spent over $122 million connecting communities, right? That's an investment, just a capital investment into the communities, let alone the ongoing operational impacts of keeping these networks running and continuing to invest in those. As an organization, TELUS has many ways in which we can do it, right? It's through the investment that we're making. And we've done some really cool things, Rob, to your point. We actually partnered with Nisga'a Nation. So Nisga'a Nation, which is the first modern treaty nation here in British Columbia, which is the province that I live in. And they came to us and they said, what's really important to us is actually ownership of the network, ownership of the assets. That's what's most important to us as a nation. So we spent 18 months sitting, listening, learning, understand how it is that we can work with one another that meets the needs of TELUS, but also meets the needs of the nation. And coming out of that, what we've developed is a wireless project that has just wrapped up this year where Nisga'a Nation actually owns the physical wireless towers in their community. And then as part of that, we've committed to training the LITs, which is Nisga's ISP, to be able to support maintenance of those towers, to be able to support how do we co-locate other providers on these towers, right? So that's the way in which Nisga'a wanted to participate with us. And then some communities want to engage with us in a more traditional, we are a connectivity provider. The other thing that I'll add too is that I think we need to look at what are the intersection points between your business and what you can do in this space. So TELUS is a leader in technology. And one of the things that we are a leader in is data ethics and responsible AI development. We have our Fuel IX AI engine, which we have built, but we recognize that we need to be responsible in the development of our AI. And to be responsible in the development of our AI is making sure that we're incorporating Indigenous perspectives into AI. AI is inherently biased because it's made by humans, and then humans inherently have bias. So we as an organization are working at different levels with Indigenous peoples and companies to understand what is Indigenous data in the context of TELUS. What role can we have in ensuring that our AI engine isn't perpetrating harmful beliefs about who Indigenous people are, and in fact plays a positive role in reframing the narrative around the negative language that you tend to hear, right? So when you ask me those questions about the opportunity, I think every company needs to sit down and think, who am I and what role do I have? Some companies will have an amazing role for procurement because of who they are and what they do. And other companies will have an amazing role from an employment perspective. So that's one of the things that I always encourage folks is think about who you are as an organization, what you do really well, and how you integrate Indigenous perspectives into those things.
Well, we'll have a separate conversation on AI in the future because we could have many conversations on AI, but it's certainly an important point you made. Carol Anne, so I'm a global investor. Canada's on my radar, but after listening to all this, it sounds really complicated. And it sounds like I'm going to have a lot of upfront costs. Why don't I just go to another country who has similar resources and develop there? Why should I make that extra effort to invest in Canada with these additional challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. And that's the work that's in front of companies. That's the work that's in front of governments to answer that and to do the foundational work of understanding the significance of the rise of Indigenous economic power in a Canadian context specifically. I think the recognition of the increase of Indigenous economic activity and the cause of that the foundation for Indigenous rights, the leveraging of that into increased Indigenous economic activity provides a significant opportunity for national and international governments to engage and invest into Indigenous businesses in an environment that is supporting significant opportunity across multiple sectors.
Yeah, and I guess there are a few reasons that make Canada as a jurisdiction attractive. It is a developed nation within G7 with rule of law still governing and respected.
North of the border, of course.
Yeah,
we're talking.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's one of the things that makes us different and why you want to do business in Canada. And when it comes to the Indigenous community, it's not a cost really of doing business. It's an investment, and it's the way to get things done. And the value that companies are now seeing, regardless of what the law says, the value companies are seeing in involving Indigenous communities in those businesses and taking advantage of the local learnings over hundreds of years. And Marissa touched on some examples. I can think of lots of reasons why a foreign company would want to make that extra effort, Mark.
Yes. Well, that's why we hold the summit every year, because we think, it demonstrates that. And as Carol Anne and Marissa have been talking, the way to succeed, to get these returns for 7 generations, because once you start working with Indigenous peoples and working in partnership with them as title holders and investors and equity partners, you're building a long-term business, which is what every business wants, which will actually have lower risk over time because insider knowledge, because the Indigenous peoples know the lay of the land, literally. And you're building strong community association, which companies want to do everywhere because they know they have to live there for a long time with those communities. So I think it does speak to that as well. Yes. Now, Marissa, you had something you wanted to add?
Can I just add, Carolyn, I can't remember if it was you who said this at our last advisory meeting or somebody else, but I think we need to reframe the narrative away from this work being extractive, right? This isn't extractive work. Working with Indigenous peoples provides significant opportunity for companies. And I know I talked about how it can make our projects better and save money for projects and reduce time, but also think about employees, right? Indigenous people are the fastest growing demographic in Canada today, right? Companies everywhere are faced with challenges around long-term employment. And as companies grow and we have a boomers retiring. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. So somebody's going to have to tell me.
Ageism. Can't do that. You can't do that, Marissa. We're not into that.
But, when you think about it, like this is a huge employee engagement opportunity. It's the opportunity to bring in new people, new perspectives into your organization. It's the opportunity to bring in more clients into your organizations. When you do things right, when you engage with Indigenous peoples, you have an increased client base that's going to come to you as an organization, right? When you understand how to support Indigenous people better, you're going to get more Indigenous clients and all of the things that come out of that, not to mention the GDP that filters back into the economy, that filters back into your organization. And I just want to add one thing. Engaged employees are so important to long-term success of our organizations. We need team members to be successful. And one of the commitments that TELUS made was to integrate Indigenous placekeeping into our offices as we renovate it. So what does that mean? We were renovating our office in Toronto. And so we actually partnered with an Indigenous organization and did a series of engagements to go, how do we incorporate Indigenous perspectives into this office, right? How do we make this office a little less corporate and a little bit more reflective of the original host nations in Toronto? As a result of that, we have this amazing space. It's oriented true north, east, southwest. You can see the water at all angles. There's a longhouse inside this space. And that is one of the most popular floors at TELUS because TELUS team members want to work there. So we're incorporating Indigenous perspectives into our business, which is making our team members happier and also reframing ways in which we do business. Can you imagine if more board meetings happen in a longhouse? What the ultimate outcomes would be for our business, right? So I think we need to just start thinking about this more globally around all of the opportunities that come from this work, as opposed to just, an extra step that you have to do in order to do work here.
Yes, thank you. That's great insight. Great. Can't wait to come to the Longhouse at TELUS in Toronto. Carol Anne.
When you're in Toronto, you're invited. Let me know.
Super. Thank you. Carol Anne, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll close with the demonstration of Indigenous economic value and increased Indigenous economic activity needs to be paid attention to nationally and globally. I think the metric system of that, we're traditionally defined within GDP, but if you look at the space of where economic value creation is happening with Indigenous businesses and how that's being leveraged, there's a story to be told. And what that story is around designing for versus happening to. This significance of exclusion of 150 plus years of exclusion versus the designing for inclusion and designing for the increase of Indigenous worldview in business and how that in itself is leveraging increased ownership and placing and centering Indigenous peoples and businesses from a power perspective, and also the realization of the significance of, in a very, very short time, the recognition of Indigenous peoples as economic powerhouses within the Canadian economy. And that's a story to be told and demonstrated across other G7 economies, across other emerging, developing economies, of centering the Indigenous relationship and what Indigenous economic power looks like in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a very powerful summary. I think that is a great way to wrap up our podcast today. Rob.
Yeah, no, I want to thank you both. Marissa, love your enthusiasm and the way you've articulated the benefits and what you've seen happen in the practical benefits at TELUS and their experience working with Indigenous people. And Carol Anne, always a pleasure to talk to you. I know you've just released your second book on the rise of Indigenous economic power, and we'll look forward to your series of conferences throughout the year, including Indigenomics on Bay Street in November, and your further research in the area. A real pleasure to speak to both of you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Marissa Nobauer and Carol Anne Hilton for sharing their insights with us. And thank you for viewing and listening. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.